Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Kendall Bauer, and today's presentation is the Astounding Dietary Adaptations of Polar Bears, presented by Expedition Leader Kristina Disney. Kristina, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Kendall. I'm very excited to be here today. As she said, my name is Kristina Disney. I've been an expedition leader here with NatHab since 2018, which kind of, when I was doing the math, is starting to blow my mind. The years are ticking by. Who would have thought? Yeah, and I got into this, via the north. I worked a bunch all over northern Canada, and with that, eventually made my way to Churchill, met some amazing NatHab guides, and I was like, man, I want to do what you do. And I eventually worked my way up and got there. And so the north is always near and dear in my heart. And one thing that I think we don't talk about, which is sort of a funny one, is that when you do sort of live and work up north in these northern climates, or if you go winter camping, anything like that, kind of like these polar explorers here, is that your metabolism kicks into a whole other gear. It's kind of amazing how much energy your body needs to power through to get you from, even just to sleep at night. I'm not even gonna lie, I remember my first week that I was living up in a dry cabin. I think I lost 10 pounds the first week until because my little southern body burnt off all this weight as it figured out how to survive there. And so that's why I had this, I wanted to pause on this picture before we moved on, because it's one of those things that I don't think we think about, right? Anyone who ever has done winter camping, if you've ever put butter into your coffee, you're not alone, because you're trying to put a huge amount of calories into your body in order to just kind of like keep going through, right? And so when you think about animals that live up there, they really do have this amazing adaptation to use and conserve energy for different times, to survive this extreme environment. And so that's kind of the direction I want to take today, but I want to do it through a single focus, or basically a single molecule. What I'd like to do today with everyone is follow vitamin A all the way from sort of through the food chain, through the polar bear, to figure out how it is that all of this is able to happen and that their bodies are able to sort of do these magnificent feats. And so before I kind of delve into that, I think we're going to do a bit of a slide back, because I know I always need a reminder of what actually is a vitamin and what really is vitamin A, right? We're all supposed to take our supplements. The doctors are always honest. Did you get enough sunshine over the wintertime, depending on where you live? Are you eating enough citrus to get your vitamin C? So what that really is, if we kind of break it down here to this base level as much as we can, is that vitamins are organic compounds that our body uses as catalysts in a reaction. So what that means is that there's already a chemical reaction happening, but a catalyst is something that helps it happen a little faster or a little more efficiency. And so these are compounds that when we consume them, they make that happen a little more efficient in our body, right? So when you think about vitamins and nutrients, it kind of makes sense, right? We can survive without all of them, or all of them in abundance, but our bodies just generally function better when we've got all these little micronutrients hanging out to help us in our bodily processes along the way. And so it gets classified as a vitamin if it's something that once we have a deficit of it, it actually can create a disease in our body. So that's kind of the big difference. We might need other things in different amounts, but if we don't have them, our body might be fine. But if we really don't have them, then our body is not okay. So that's what's going to get termed as a vitamin. Vitamin A is a group of compounds sort of that you can see here. So they're retinols, retinoic acid. And so it's this general branch. You always think about them as like chains. That's kind of how organic chemistry works. And in all fairness, I promise not to do much chemistry, because chemistry was never my favorite. I was always better at the biology. So I'll keep it brief, but it's kind of fun to think about it this way and to visualize it. So they have different chains on the end, and so if you follow, there's the main organic circle at the bottom. Now if you follow that chain to the top, it's the tails that tend to change. The chain stays pretty solid, but it's the tails that change as it gets processed by our bodies. And so the big thing with vitamin A is that it's fat soluble. That's a really important thing to remember. And the other thing to remember is that we generally when we're consuming it for our bodies, we kind of get it in two forms. We get it in something called provitamin and preformed vitamin. So if it's provitamin, we're probably getting it from another animal source, something like dairy or fish or meat, whereas previtamin is coming from plants, and it's actually coming from plant pigment. And that pigment is beta carotene, which comes from the Latin word carotene, right? Or that's the Latin word for carrot. And that's that orange color. That's what it's named for. And so our bodies can take that pigment and change those tails out and make it into vitamin A. Essentially, it's kind of in like a dormant phase until we change the tails on those molecules that I was showing you. And then once we change the tails on them, then our body can use it for the processes that it needs, which is pretty cool. Now, you know, there's always such thing, anything's a poison in a certain amount. And so in our bodies, we have to be really careful about those. Our bodies are very careful about when it changes it over, because while it's still a pigment, it's kind of benign in our body. We can eat as many carrots as you physically possibly can, and that won't really make you sick. But a funny thing that will happen is that if you did happen to eat too many carrots in your life, you can build up essentially that yellowish pigment or that orange pigment in your skin. And I don't know why, if anyone out there had kids in the 90s, Magic School Bus, this one episode has stuck with me my whole life, of when Arthur, his skin turns, or Arnold's skin turns orange. And I've never forgotten it. I always think about it. And then I actually met someone 2 years ago who this happened to in real life. So it went from just being a colloquial kid story to being someone who at a Christmas party, she's like, no, I definitely did that. I was like, wow, she was orange. It's crazy. Anyways, so we can build up the pigments and it doesn't make us sick, but then if we change the tails and we turn it into that retinol, then that's what can make us sick. And so our bodies are always doing this dance of accumulating as much as we need and then slowly turning it over for when we need to use it. And so the question is, what are we using it for? So a really big one and a really important one that I want you to try and hold on to today while we're going through this is that it's really big and important for helping our cells grow and develop. So that can be at the infant stage. Newborns actually have higher amounts of vitamin A because they need to do so much growing. And in just throughout our whole lives, our skin, for that to grow. It also supports our vision. So if you think back to, we have a retina, right? And that vitamin it's actually called retinol, right? And it's sort of linked to that same use. It's one of the ones that actually ties to the protein in our eyes that helps us see. So again, thinking back to eating lots of carrots being orange. Has anyone heard the line, eat enough carrots, it's good for your eyesight? That's why. It's because of that beta carotene. That's actually, it literally is good for your eyesight. It's giving you more of those vitamins that you need in order for that protein to react properly for you to see light. It does other great things like supports our immune system. It's really good. I kind of mentioned this with the babies, right? That growing development stage. It's a huge, huge part of this. And so in our bodies, we tend to store vitamin A in our liver. Not just vitamin A, so like fat solubles. So vitamin A, D, E, and K, those are all fat soluble, and our liver hangs on to those really, really well. And there's also vitamin B hanging out in there, which is not quite as fat soluble. And our body can actually store enough vitamin A. So if we're eating, let's say we're eating lots of carrots, it's summertime, I hope you've got some carrots in the garden that you can go and chow down on, because there's not much better than that in the world, is fresh summer carrots and peas. So your body can hold on to that vitamin A for 4 years. If you eat a lot of it and then for some reason your diet changed and you didn't have access to it, your body's able to store enough in your liver to carry you through for 4 years. Right? So we now have diets that are very regular. You know, we get foods brought in from other places in the world. But if you think about the evolution of humans, right, we're very seasonal. You only have access to some foods sometimes a year. True for lots of animals, right? So this idea of being able to stockpile these nutrients, these vitamins in our bodies is super key to times of fasting, you know, scarcity, right? It's one of the ways that we're able to survive that. So really important. And so what our liver is doing, if we think about it in our body, is that the liver is taking the blood that's around the that's sort of circulated through the stomach walls and the intestines, and it brings that to the liver and it sort of filters it out, and it's going to take some of the nutrients and hold on to them. It also takes out some of the bad things too, right? So if it takes out it has bile, so that bile get excreted back into the intestine. That'll get removed out of your body as feces. It also breaks down things in your blood and sends them back, and those will get filtered out by your kidneys. So it's our biggest, it's a big organ, and it's doing a lot of heavy lifting to make sure that we have got enough to make it through, and it regulates a lot of things. Excuse me. It's that regulation that's so key, right? And so you can, at the end of the day, have too much of a good thing. Hypervitaminosis is worth it almost just to get to say that word. So in the case of, if you have too much vitamin A, right, we can sort of OD on it, and that's when it's full vitamin A. That's not when it's the pigment in the vegetable, not when it's the color orange. It's kind of after we've turned it into proper vitamin A. So acute toxicity, so that's when you eat too much of it in a short amount of time, or you just eat like a huge amount of it just in one shot maybe. Things that can happen are things like you can get bone pain, your skin can change, it can be really, but then chronic actually will build up over time. So that only happens in our world. It doesn't happen very often, right? But things like supplements, if people tend to get taking too much of the same supplements, actually even things like acne medication, they can, just because of what they're trying to control your skin with, they can actually cause vitamin toxicity, which is sort of crazy when you think about it. But back in the day, over the years of humans traveling the world and living in different places around the world, this was something that you had to deal with on a more regular basis. Either inefficiencies or excess of things happening, because you didn't have these moderated diets like that we do have today. And some of the most interesting ones come up in really dire situations of Arctic explorations, often strandings or shipwrecks, things like that. They're running really low, and so they're starving. And so there's stories, some of the earliest written accounts are from sort of the 16th century of how, coming from Russia and places like that. And there's one castaway, there's a quote, it's like, "Heaven had sent us succor at a time of utter distress, of a polar bear windfall, and our gratitude for this miraculous gift was apparent in our overflowing happiness," right? So if you think about it, if you've been on a crew of starving people, you're not really probably going to eat in moderation. And so even though lots of indigenous populations all around the world know not to eat polar bear liver, and arguably different explorers do too, in times of stress, you tend to sort of, the hunger probably outcompetes whatever else in your brain is telling you not to do it. And so it can cause it can ultimately kill you, but it has a whole bunch of horrible, really painful sort of overdosing side effects on the way. So you have hair loss, extreme peeling of your skin. For females, there can be birth defects, vomiting, blurred vision, loss of motor control. And there's, accounts of officers swearing to never ever eat polar bear liver again. Like they'd rather die than go through that again because their whole crew had been poisoned. So what's going on there? Why is there so much vitamin A, or how much vitamin A really is in a polar bear liver? So for you and I, a healthy adult person can tolerate around 10,000 units of vitamin A. So that's sort of the recommended daily dose is, I think, about 0.9 milligrams. So very, very small. And if us as humans, so 10,000 is kind of what we need. If we start eating somewhere between 25 to 33,000 units, that's when we start getting poisoning. That's when we start getting that toxicity buildup in our system. Now, to put this into scale, right? Liver is a big organ. So for a polar bear, it's going to be even bigger. It's going to be really big. So 1 pound, so if you kind of imagine about your fist, the size of your fist, so 1 pound of a polar bear liver has 9 million units of vitamin A. So that is enough to kill as many as 52 full-blown adults. That's how much, if you were to sit down and eat it. So that could basically kill off a whole crew and a ship. Or another way to say it is that if you were to spread that out and only eat your recommended dose every day, you would have enough vitamin A for 143 years. And that's just 1 pound. That's not the whole liver, right? That's kind of crazy. So it's, the whole liver would be for the adults, but the whole liver would take you over 143 years. But it's a lot, right? Like it's a huge, huge amount of buildup. One, the bear's still alive and thriving. They're a mammal too. Like, how is it that they're able to do that? And two, how did it get there? So, oh yeah, sorry. So these are the, before I get a little bit ahead of myself here, I'm jumping ahead of my storyline. So after consuming it, some of the things that you need to be sort of keeping in mind, or these are the things that sailors or explorers would have been feeling back in the day, would be muscle cramps, your tongue could turn gray, and this one, so the skin peeling, that can happen for up to 30 days. Like it starts within a few hours of the toxicity and can go on for nearly a month, which is pretty wild. And that's not the only thing that sailors had to worry about, or explorers had to worry about back in the day. Another big one, in general, polar bears are pretty low on parasites given the environment that they're in, right? When you think about, we don't have malaria in northern mosquitoes, we have it in more near the equator, kind of the same general rule of thumb. There's just less diseases and parasites that are able to survive in the Arctic. But one that they do have to deal with is trichinosis, which is a worm that like buries into the meat. And unless you really cook the meat of whatever you're eating, that life cycle can transfer through into the next host. And it's really, really painful and can be quite terrible. And so I guess to wrap that up a little bit, this is a painting. It's from 1873 or so by a guy named Jules von Paer, and he titled it. He was actually an officer on this expedition, and he titled it "Going Out for Dinner." And so, the years of sort of bears and humans coexisting, or one hunting the other. The reason why I really like this painting, and when we think about this, of you're either the meal that help the bear survive for the winter, or it's the bear is the meal that helps the explorer survive for the winter. So we called it "Going Out for Dinner," and I don't know if you've had enough time to look at it yet, but the reason why I find it quite entertaining is because if you look, the bear is hiding behind the ice there, and so the question always is, who is going out for dinner? Is it the bear or is it the explorer? And lastly, that I'm talking about these poisonings things being really serious in that era, but also, cultures and communities have been aware of it and have dealt with it in different ways. Inuit very rarely would eat polar bear liver. That would often be something that would be distributed and fed to their dogs because their metabolisms are able to handle it a little bit better. And so, yeah, sort of that knowledge does exist, but it gets lost from time to time as stories go. All right, so this is what I wanted to get to. How did it get there? How is there so much, and how did it get there, right? So if we look at the Arctic ecosystem, if we look at the food web that it's going through, it has to do with polar bears being an apex predator, right? They're at the top of the food chain, and their main source of food in general is seals, or specifically seal blubber. So they eat more than just ring seals. That's their kind of primary prey. They also eat walruses and other seal species and things like that. But the primary one is ring seals. There's about 2 million ring seals in the Arctic. Population of polar bears is approximated around 25,000 polar bears. And so on average, your average healthy adult bear needs to eat 43 seals in a year. And what they're mostly after is the blubber. If you have a healthy, successfully hunting polar bear, they often will leave behind a lot of the meat and just strip the blubber and leave that for scavengers or other younger bears who aren't quite doing as well yet. So they're really after the blubber. They're after that. I said at the beginning, that brick of butter in your coffee. It sounded ridiculous, but that's kind of what they're after. They're basically just surviving on fat because of how much energy their bodies need to survive in that cold climate. And so if we think about the seal's body, right? So seals have a really, really high amount of vitamin A in their blubber. And it's for a couple different reasons. One, I said it's fat soluble, right? So vitamin A gets stored in fat. Fat is the primary currency of the Arctic. And so you find it all across their body. They also store it in their liver. The liver in general in all mammals is kind of the highest place. But if you just look at it, it's sort of like, so there's more blubber on the seal's body. So just by mass, there's more vitamin A in the blubber, right? So with that though, it has to do with how swiftly they need to grow and the life cycles that the seals have as well. So a polar bear is mostly interested in the blubber, which has if you're looking there, about 50 milligrams, right? So that's 50 times as much as a human could eat in a day, and that is what one seal would eat in a meal, or excuse me, one polar bear would eat in a single seal meal. But it also has to do with, remember before I said, what do we use vitamin A for in our body? We use it for growing. So seal pups, which is kind of like the buffet of polar bears in the springtime, seal pups have a huge amount of vitamin A in them because they need to grow so quickly. And so they've done a lot of studies on this, and they've found that vitamin A, so when the seal pup is born, they don't have a lot of vitamin A in their body, but for ring seals, the first 12 days that they're nursing from mom, she is lactating, and she's shifting over all of this crazy fat-rich milk to the pup, and that is depositing heavy amounts of vitamin A in their body so that they can grow really quickly. So they basically go from having something like about a 6%, fat weight to about a 90% body fat mass within 12 days. Like they're just cranking over. It's like a fat conveyor belt, basically, is what lactation really is. And they need that, and they need it to grow quickly. They also need it to, so most seals, they have to undergo their first molt before they can go into the water. And so that also requires a lot of vitamin A, and it requires a lot of energy, right? So that's a huge part. So if you think about the polar bears, they're eating the majority of their diet because they fast a really long time too, right? When they, if the sea ice melts where they live, or hunting gets a little bit weak, but springtime is always where they eat a lot. So that's where they're gonna eat as many of these pups as they possibly can. Sorry if you're on the pup side, it's a hard one to get through. And if we look at the life cycle of what the seal is doing, that's when they are just cranked, or they're just like built up on so much vitamin A. And so if we think about all of this, it's all being sort of fluidly run through fat, excuse me. Fat is the connector of all this, right? Polar bear wants to put on fat, so it eats the fat, or more specifically, the blubber of the seal. So blubber is, number one of my favorite words to say, and I will say it as many times in this webinar as I feasibly can. But it's a specialized form of fat, to such a point that actually lots of biologists don't even consider it fat anymore. And so the reason why it is so specialized is that it has a higher amount of collagen. So collagen is kind of what helps your skin sort of stay stiff, excuse me. And so if you kind of look at this example of sort of younger skin or aging skin in the top right, so collagen is kind of like the bands or the rubbery bits that hold the fat molecules together, and blubber has a much higher amount of that than any other type of fat that sort of exists out there today. Now those fat cells themselves, the fancy word for them is adipocytes, and these are actually pretty cool. So if we go back to that baby seal and we think about it for a second, so the baby seal is born without a lot of blubber, and it's going to start drinking milk from mom. It's going to start putting on weight. So what does it actually mean to put on weight? So when we're born, these adipocytes, we're kind of born with, and this is true for us too, humans or seal, we're born with a set number of them. And so that initial growth, that really crazy weight, when the seal cub might go, or seal pup might go from, 15, 20 pounds up to nearly 100 pounds, depending on the size, or maybe 80. What's happening is they are growing some new cells, but what they're actually doing is they're ballooning these adipocytes. So they're mostly kind of protein and water. If you look, it looks like an empty balloon in the top left there. And as we put on more fat, then we deposit these fat droplets, and then it actually sort of balloons out and fills with fat. And so when we're growing, pretty much until adulthood, our body is doing two things. One, it's sort of filling and emptying those balloons. And two, when we're growing, we do create more cells like that. But once you hit maturity, once we kind of have stopped growing, if you're a baby seal and you hit adulthood, or once you're no longer a teenager and you kind of settle in as a human, our body in general stops making new cells like these. It just sort of inflates or deflates the ones that we already have with the fat that we consume. So that's always kind of something to think about, or it's an interesting thing to think about. And so that newborn, they're going to fill them up really quickly, and with that is also that vitamin A transport, right? Those, again, blubber is the currency of the Arctic. That's what I want you to remember when this is all over. So this is the seal. We've only made it as far as the first real step down into the food web. So what is the seal eating? What is mama seal eating in order to have this much fat? She has like, so her milk is about 30% fat. So think about that for anyone who likes homogeneous milk, or 3% milk is too creamy for you. Their milk is 30% fat, very, very high. Well, what they tend to feed on, one of their primary components in their diet is polar cod. Polar cod is about maybe 10 inches long. Again, it's compared to Atlantic cod or anything like that. So its body size, it's really, really fat rich. So also, this isn't the only thing that seals are eating. I kind of joke sometimes that seals are like raccoons of the sea. They're eating things off the bottom, like benthic things like mussels and clams and mollusks, and they're going for squid and krill. They kind of eat anything that they get, but depending on where they are, sort of within the Arctic and their ecosystem, they'll probably specialize in something or the other. But kind of like raccoons, they'll find it all. And so seals are catching and consuming this really, really fat-rich fish, and that fat is important. It's on so many levels. It's not just for energy; it's also insulation, right? It's preventing their bodies from freezing. When you think about that, right? These are in some very, very cold waters. These fish are living, and so it serves so many amazing functions. So this is the polar cod. The next question comes is, what are the polar cod eating that is making them so fat? And that comes to these beautiful zooplankton known as copepods. So copepods are sometimes called the Arctic feed. They're very, very tiny, and they are a key component in the ecosystem in so many ways. When we think about baleen whales, the ones that filter out all the little bits, these are like one of the smallest organisms that are keeping alive one of the biggest organisms, and are also filling in the food chain so many ways up. And so if you look at this is a photo of 3 different species, not just 3 different growing size. And you can kind of see that hollow tube in the center. That is their fat deposits. And I know this may not seem super exciting, but this is an example of how invasive species are affecting the Arctic. So as the sea ice becomes thinner and thinner, and so like southern, let's say Atlantic species are able to move, like Atlantic cod are coming north, and these sort of southern copepods are coming north. Their bodies are not adapted to store fat as much. So that means that, let's say you had a copepod that wasn't as nice and fat and chubby on the inside, a polar cod would have to eat maybe 10 to 1 of the Atlantic cod to get the same nutrients that it would to eat one of the Arctic copepods. So if you think about that, it's expending 10 times the amount of energy to eat the same amount of food that it needs to survive, which means that its actual body health is declining. And that has this rippling effect all the way up the food chain, because if you have skinnier copepods being eaten by skinnier polar cod, which then takes more cod for the seal to eat, then it's expending more energy, and they're skinnier all the way up to the polar bear. So you can see that that's actually a really big effect when it comes to invasive species. We're like, well, they eat the same thing, they do the same thing. Like yes, but no, right? Like each animal has sort of like manufactured or figured out its own niche. And so once you start changing that, it does have effects in ways that that affect everyone else being present too. All right, now our copepods, I said they were zooplankton, right? So they're going around, and sometimes they eat other copepods, but they're also grazers. And if they are grazers, they have to have something to eat. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the equivalent of the grassy lawn or the forest or the garden of the Arctic. What you're looking at is the upside down image of the sea ice. Doesn't look super exciting, doesn't it? Kind of looks a little bit slimy, but it's really cool. It's super cool. It's filled with so much teeming life. It's kind of unbelievable. And if you look at it, it's not a Photoshop thing. You kind of see the ice at the bottom far away looks green where the light is coming through. But if you look at that ice, it's a little orange, isn't it? Kind of an interesting thing to notice. And so that orange is the collection of different phytoplankton that are photosynthesizing in the ice, right? They're converting that sunlight into CO2 or into carbon chains. Sorry, they're converting the CO2 and oxygen via sunlight into carbon chains that's going to kick off the whole ecosystem. And that's kind of a mix of diatoms. So that's what that circle sort of shell is that you're looking on the side. That's one of the ones that we can find in the sea ice. And another one that we can find that might be familiar is dinoflagellate. If anyone's heard of red tides, it's the same grouping. And so these little tiny organisms, right? These are our hard workers at the bottom of our food chain. And the sea ice is kind of like the platform within which they survive and thrive. Too much sea ice is bad because if it gets too thick, the sun can't get through. And then the inverse happens is this. So let's say we think about springtime. So as that ice starts to melt, there's this like happy medium point where it's this like platform that's going to host all of these phytoplankton as well as the open water beneath it. And so it's a really amazing, impressive time. If you think about those few weeks, really, at most a month or two in the Arctic spring, that takes off with the most impressive productivity that we have in our whole world. That's why things like gray whales migrate, or like gray whales and humpbacks, they go from the top and bottoms, right? Or why all of these different birds migrate literally thousands and thousands of kilometers to go and nest here, because there's so much food abundance that it is worth these, cross global treks to get to this highly productive place. So why is it so productive? Because it's cold. It's still cold, but it's the light. It's all about the light. There is so much light there, right? We go from polar day to polar night. And so that means that, our longest day, if we're in the northern hemisphere, we'll just stick with that for now. Obviously inverse it for if you're in the southern hemisphere today. But, we have our longest night, if you're above the Arctic Circle, is complete darkness, but the inverse happens, which means that your summers have midnight sun, it's daylight so long. And so your plants don't have to go to sleep. They can just be little engines trucking along, making as much sugars for that whole summer period. And so it's just super, super high productivity, right? But something you might not think about that comes with that productivity is that, so yes, you can get all of that energy, but I don't know if this happens to anybody else. If you get too much energy, you can get a sunburn. And we don't think about it. I think we have a hard time thinking about sunburns for other species, even other mammals, but I think we have a really hard time thinking about sunburn for even things like phytoplankton. The energy that comes from the sun is super high, and it can be damaging to our bodies just as much as it can to theirs. And so they have some really interesting ways of dealing with that. So if you are a photosynthesizing organism, then you have chlorophyll and you have a few other pigments, and that's what you use to sort of collect and redirect the energy from the sun. And it can kind of be split into two different pigment classes. There's light harvesting pigments. So those are ones that are designed to collect the energy from the sun and, produce sugars. And then there are also photoprotective carotenoids. So photoprotective, those are kind of like the sunburn pigments, or that's like the sunscreen pigments of the phytoplankton, so that it doesn't burn up, because if that too much energy can break up the cells, there's no bueno. And so you can kind of think about it, I guess you could think about pigments like the solar panels of the cell. So some of the pigments are designed to collect the energy and convert it for use. That's most of them. But our carotenoids, they do a different function. So they act as sunscreen. So they kind of take some of that energy away so that it doesn't overwhelm the cell. And what it does with it is it uses it to actually create heat, which is pretty functional if you think about it. If you're living somewhere in the Arctic where it's always pretty bitter cold, it's nice to have your own sort of side effect heat system built in. So it does a dual purpose. It's both your sunscreen, and and the carotenoids can help with a little bit of heating, which is pretty impressive. So if we take a look at where we find these pigments, so I'm talking about these photoprotective pigments, these carotenoids that I'm talking about, they've been able to map them around the world. And if we take a big look out at the world, right, where do we need to have the most amount of sunscreen? We need to have it where we have the most brutal amount of sun. So if we look at this sort of, so purple is very little, and then green and orange and red is there's higher amounts of these pigments. So you can see that we're finding them up north, right? Sort of, you can see them across the Atlantic, and then you can see really high concentrations of them further up. So let's just zoom in for a second. kind of a little blurry, so you have to forgive me here. But if we zoom in and think about this, it makes a lot of sense. If you go too far north, you have multi-year ice. So multi-year ice can be like 5-6 meters thick. So, you're looking at like 15, 18 meters, or sorry, 18 feet of ice. So not a lot of light gets through there. So if you go too far north, they don't need this pigment, or there's not even any photosynthesizing happening because they can't get through that icy layer. But then if you look at the coasts where the ice, freezes and thaws every single year, man, look at how much pigment there is there in the ocean. And so that means that that's how much phytoplankton is there, how much biodiversity. These are the places that all of these organisms are congregating because that photosynthesis is able to happen. So what are they protecting from, right? So photoprotective carotenoids, they are absorbing blue-green light. So if we go back to the basics, we go back to our friend Roy G. Biv here, and we look at the rainbow. So that blue light is really high energy, and sort of those red, orange is lower energy. And so light is about absence, right? White light is we can see everything, and then once you take something away or absorb it, we see the opposite. So if our photoprotective carotenoids are absorbing the blue and the green, then what's left for our eyes to see is going to be orange and red. Hey, we're coming full circle. So there's a really cool study that they found. This one was looking at cyanobacteria, and it found that under really intense amounts of light, that carotenoid actually does. So this is an image of what those molecules actually look like, those photoprotective. And so that orange shift to red actually happens when the molecule, so if it gets too much light, it actually changes the shape of itself. So if you think about like it's sort of like what's that called? It's like a Rubik's Cube, sort of. It reconfigures itself, changes those tails on that organic molecule so that it can hold and bear more light. So it kind of goes from an orange consuming to a red consuming, or red showing, sorry. And so that's that really big shift that happens. And that's what's able to protect that really high amount of energy, but still allow the rest of the cell to keep photosynthesizing and keep creating all that energy. So if you think about this, it's not just the carrots that are orange, it's the algae that is orange, right? That's how come our garden of the Arctic is orange. And it explains why we have that crystalline there. And that's the diatoms, they get that color, the dinoflagellates get it. And I kind of sort of said it a little too soon than I meant to. But dinoflagellates, they are also common in something that even if you don't live in the Arctic, you might be aware of, or if you live somewhere along the coast, right? So dinoflagellates are associated with red tide. And what red tide is it's a huge algal bloom. So it's a bunch of really high amount of production of dinoflagellates. And it has a lot of negative connotation for a couple of reasons. One is that because it can often contain a lot of toxins, or that essentially can build up in different shellfish and can really wreak havoc on ecosystems. Also those algal blooms themselves, right? So what's happening there is that's kind of like a natural cycle, and it would occur in nature anyways. They happen when you have upwelling of a lot of nutrients from below and warmer weather. But the problem is that our oceans, have warmed significantly, and we've been dumping nutrients via sewer, fertilizers, and that into the ocean, which means that these tides, which were less frequent and maybe less devastating, are becoming more and more common, to the point that sort of this whole food source is being threatened, right? So for me, as someone who does like to go actually, get clams and oysters in the wintertime, but to be really careful of paralytic shellfish poisoning, because those molecules, those toxins, can stay in the shellfish months, sometimes even years after that tide has gone through. And so it's really destabilized this huge food source, which is pretty unfortunate. And I'm going to take this one step further. I said we're going to tie the whole ecosystem together. I'm going to go down to cellular, just to see how cool it is that this vitamin A story is going to tie us all the way through, right? Because remember, that pigment is still the same pigment that's going to come back to us as vitamin A in our bodies. So this red tide thing it happens around the world. There's lots of different species of dinoflagellates that do it. Some of them are poisonous, some of them are not. Also keep that in mind. But there was a cool study that showed that because they were looking at these poisons and these dinoflagellates, they can actually trace back. One of the ways that we can kind of prove how like life started on Earth is the idea that so let's say there's these 3 different species of dinoflagellate, and they each have this one type of toxin, and the only way they could have got it is if they had all sort of consumed the same precursor molecule back in the day. So by back in the day, I mean like 2 billion years ago, just casually. And so it's one of those threads in science that we use that actually helps us tie together our whole theory of evolution. So give dinoflagellates a little bit of credit, despite the havoc that they reach. Okay, that was a lot. I feel like we went really big to really small. So we're going to recap, and we're going to go small to big, and we're going to tie this all together now. So the thing that's really important, there is a lot of phytoplankton up in our Arctic, and because of that high amount of sunshine, it needs sunscreen, aka photoprotective carotenoids, which creates that awesome orange color that our eyes see. And we find it all across the north, and obviously there's a reverse that happens in Antarctica too, with the changing seasons, and that forms the basis of our food chain, right? And if we think about moving up that food chain, this is kind of an oversimplified version, right? There's obviously lots more trendles and things happening there, but the currency of the Arctic is fat. And so that fat-soluble vitamin A, as it gets consumed by, our copepods, our small krill, things like that, it gets carried up the chain with their fat, and then up to the next level of consumers, right? We have, either the potentially squid, Arctic cod, whichever you might be looking for. And those are going to eventually make their way as they get consumed by the polar bear's primary component of its diet, which is the seal. Seal pups particularly, right? Because they need to grow quickly, they need to recover. So their bodies are just full of vitamin A, so much of it. And that's going to form the primary meal. So that's going to go from a large amount of vitamin A, and it's going to build up because it never gets let go, right? It's going to get carried through the whole way up to the apex predator. And then if you're a polar bear, right? I said before that a healthy person, we might have 10,000 units, whereas a polar bear, just 1 pound of their liver has 9 million units. So it gets carried all the way up. So that gets carried with the fat, the vitamin A gets brought all the way forward, all the way from a pigment in chlorophyll up to what constitutes the blubber of a seal, and now the fat that's going to keep our nice polar bear warm. But it should start to ask the question, why aren't the polar bears getting sick? If we get really sick, how is it that the polar bear is okay with this nearly belligerent amount of vitamin A in its body, right? Well, if we go back to the liver, they have something that's called an idocell, or edocell, I think it's idocell. And so what that is it's the cell that helps hold onto the fat soluble, and so it's kind of like the processor. And so in our bodies, we have some of it, right? But we think about those fat cells growing and narrowing. The idocell is about 4 times as much present in a polar bear's liver than it is in ours. And that's one of the reasons why they're able to handle this crazy amount of vitamin A in their bodies, which is pretty spectacular. And this might all seem very sort of far away from your day-to-day life, and you're not worried about vitamin A overload or deficiencies, but it actually shows up in our daily life more often than, or not the toxicity, but vitamin A and this concept of all this is actually pretty common in our daily life, but we didn't know that it's sort of being regulated for us on a grander scheme. So for anyone out there who does drink milk or dairy, you might have not even stopped noticing it, but they often say vitamin A and D added. And the reason why is because when they skim out the fat, those fat molecules take the vitamins with them, and then the company actually adds the vitamins back in. So that's why it's always saying, vitamin A and D added. And so I hope you walk away with realizing that fat and blubber are the key components of the Arctic. They are the reason why all these organisms are able to survive and thrive up there. But that the system that they've developed to survive in the Arctic ecosystem does sort of come with a cost, right? Or it comes with something they have to adapt to in and of itself, because we get that bioaccumulation, right? You start at the very small species, only have a little bit, but it never leaves, and then it builds up in the next trophic level, and the next trophic level, and the next one, so on, until we get to our apex predators. And so in this case, we're talking about vitamin A, which is something that is arguably, it is natural and it is present, and their bodies are used to dealing with it. But the same story is true for anything that's fat soluble in the ecosystem. So when we talk about persistent or pollutants, like organic pollutants, right? Probably the most famous one is DDT, which is pretty much banned in most of North America, and still is allowed in a few places in the world. But an interesting thing about the Arctic is that those, compounds that have been banned for, decades, if not longer, in sort of, we'll say this, higher populated areas, are still present in the Arctic. That legacy is still being carried on today. It is still there, and those bodies are still having to deal with it. And what's also kind of terrifying, if I'm going to admit it, is that there are, every so often we realize that we created a molecule that actually doesn't break down that also does this. And so they kind of, just as we were phasing out ones from 50 years ago, there are new ones being created today, or new ones that we're recognizing we created in the last little while that are also not good. And so it's a really hard dance, because things get created without, fully understanding the consequences of it, and what it's going to do to the ecosystem. And so as an apex predator, they carry the burden of those choices, right? It's a rough go, and it has a lot of consequences in this sort of bigger picture way. So the balance is yet to be struck, I would say. But with that, I will end us there and say thank you for your time and pass it back to Kendall.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristina. That was really interesting. You did a really great job of covering all of the questions as you went along. So I will invite people to submit any questions that they may have that are remaining. So let's go ahead and get into it. First question. Someone's curious about so the people who live in the Arctic and consume blubber all winter, and whether or not the vitamin A has any sort of negative effects on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So yeah, right. So that when we're looking at the seal blubber, if there's sort of 50 milligrams, and depending on how much they're eating in a day, you would get a buildup, but you also wouldn't get sorry, how to say this? It would depend on where they're starting from, but it also depends on the time of year that you're eating the bear. So there's kind of these like windows, and so the same would probably go with the seals. You wouldn't have that high concentration all year round, so that spring window would probably have a lot, and then the rest of the year. And so the same way that I said, like our bodies can kind of store and then deposit, there would be kind of a seasonal cycle with that. And to be honest, there also might be even like a little bit of a higher tolerance if that's your consistent diet to some extent, right? But it's actually kind of an interesting one to think about how that would then like, affect growth then for people too, right? Like we think about it, the next level of that of having more vitamin A, meaning that you would, have the ability to grow more, they even talk about like, Arctic hunters having really great sight. You're like, oh, maybe that's like linked to the amount of vitamin A they're consuming. I don't know, it's a cool trend to follow.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this next question, but I'll throw it out anyway. Do other marine mammals such as orcas and dolphins handle vitamin A in the same way as polar bears?
Yeah, so I think it would be roughly the same. I think they would also probably rely on a higher concentration of IDA cells, but I will admit, I don't know if they have other adaptations in addition to that, but pretty much any marine mammal or, anything that's sort of in that cycle would have to have the ability to. And I think the other difference too in their case might be that proportionally a lot of those other marine mammals don't just strip and eat the blubber, they eat the whole animal, so it would have a little bit more, like the diet would be a little bit more evened out too. So you kind of have to think about how much they're like proportionally how much they're consuming kind of meal to meal, but yeah, I would guess they'd have a similar adaptation.
Next question, are seals and polar bears obligate carnivores? Am I saying that right?
Yeah, that is a great question. So yes is the answer, although I really hate the word obligate. In nature, I feel like it means to some extent. So yeah, seals are not omnivores. They just eat. You might catch them eating like chewing something, but more or less, their diet is eating is predation. Polar bears are more or less obligate carnivores. They're hyper-carnivores. Like 99% of their diet is that people like to point out that they'll see polar bears eating berries on land or when they're waiting for the sea ice to form or things like that. But if you look at what that really is relative to their body needs, it's less than 1% of their caloric intake. Like it's not a real, it's more like chewing gum for them than it is really anything nutrient wise. So yes, they are. But again, when you think about them being in the bear family, their digestion is capable to some extent of digesting other things. Like you'll see them eating seaweed, but that's more again about micronutrients when they're on shore. Like that's why I don't really like the word obligate, because it means that when you start looking at an animal and you understanding how its behavior and life cycle fits together, you start coming up with all these exceptions. And then I feel like obligate isn't a great word, but yes, more or less.
Okay. There were a couple questions about the red tide toxins, so I'm gonna combine those real quick for you since we're getting short on time. Since clams can hold on to red tide toxins for so long, do you have to know the history of a beach before you go clamming there? And another question was, someone's noticed throughout the years there are more red tides in the south of the U.S. and could this be due, some of it be due to El Nino influence?
Yeah, so maybe I'll do the second one first. So having El Ninos will definitely up the number. Staying in that sort of that climate regime will add to it, and then sort of overall warming, all of that kind of comes into play. And so, in years where we have that, we'll have more of it more frequently. And then just, generally warmer summer weather time is starting to become a thing. I don't know if anyone looked at the news report, but like June was the hottest month recorded on Earth ever. It's kind of crazy. So yeah, all of that kind of compounds and makes it more probable, or makes it take off more. And then regard to the clam question, so yeah, this is one that I don't really mess around with, because even though I think I probably do take lots of risks eating different things in the woods, most toxins are not the terrifying ones. Most of them you might get sick but the problem is that the really bad ones, you only need 1 or 2 cells of it in order to get it. And so knowing the history is good. Personally, I don't harvest from beaches that don't get tested, which is a really hard one here in Canada because we don't have a great testing force for our Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and so it's really only a select number that actually do get tested. And so, yeah, sort of kind of knowing history is good. I would highly suggest checking in with the appropriate authorities before you go and harvest anything. The general sort of old rule was never harvest in a month that doesn't have an R in it. But the shoulder season of that is like sort of the spring and fall. People are being less confident about, even because we keep having these warmer summers and longer falls. So like I usually only do it in kind of the middle of winter in beaches that have been tested. And also, I mean, I'll also give a nod to there's also lots of sort of local or indigenous knowledge about where the clam is and where they actually hold the toxins in their body. So you can eat some parts but not. And yeah, I could have a whole conversation about just this one. I feel like there's a bit of there's a whole thing in Canada with scare tactics about not accessing that food source, but I'm not going to go down that tangent right
now. So essentially just do your research.
Please do your research. I'm so torn in this moment because I highly, highly encourage foraging. I think it's one of the greatest things ever, or doing your own harvesting. But also from me saying this, please do not just go out and go grab some clams from the coast where you are. Also you don't want to get clams near cities where all that sewer effluent is coming out. Really think about where your food is coming from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent point. All right, well, it is the top of the hour, so I'm going to call it there with questions, and I'd like to hand it back over to you, Kristina, for closing comments.
Lovely. Thank you, Kendall, and thank you everyone for joining today. This is one of my most favorite nerdy topics because it ties everything together, which I think is just great. And yeah, I got a couple more webinars coming up, but I'm getting excited. I think it's less than 2 months. I'm going to be off to Churchill, so stay tuned for a couple more bear stories between now and then, and if not, hopefully maybe one day I'll see you up in Churchill.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out the rest of this week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.